wonderful occasion to welcome everyone to hear from our dear Professor Susan Jurow. She is highly regarded as a learning scientist around the country. You know of her work in the food movement. I want to call out the fact that she won a campus award, the Provost Award in 2009 for her article, and I did have to look up the title.
So would I.
Expanding disciplinary expertise in a middle school mathematics classroom, recontextualizing student models in conversations with visiting specialists. But that was kind of the super launch and acceleration of now a much more visible career that is splendid. So you know of her work with JLS, and you know with her work as co-chair of the conference this summer, the International Conference of the Learning Sciences. And I think also all of the former students in the room know that in addition to being an exceptional researcher, she is an exacting teacher. And you have the benefit of her teaching you about how to do that quality research and the conception of design and learning spaces that she has been so vigorous in promoting. So welcome and thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I know you're all busy. I'm busy too. That's the title of my talk. So I want to start my talk today with a vignette that highlights the nature of the changing practices that are taking place in the community where I've been working for the past 2 years. The changes have significant implications, I argue, for what people are learning, who people are becoming, and the communities in which these changes are taking hold and which are themselves becoming transformed. This is an image of one of the families that participates in the Backyard Garden program started by the community nonprofit Revision, whose real name I use with their permission. This is Patty, one of the 8 promotoras, or community connectors, from the nonprofit who works with families to design and grow their gardens. The use of promotoras derives from a community health and engagement model rooted in Latin American culture. Promotoras act as a link between communities and institutions. This garden is in the heart of the Westwood neighborhood in a mid-sized city right off of one of its major thoroughfares. The neighborhood has been identified as a food desert by the U.S. Department of Agriculture because its residents, many of whom are Mexican immigrants to the U.S., living at or below the poverty line, have limited geographic access to a grocery store that sells fresh, healthy, and affordable food. On one of my visits to this garden, the police were in the apartment complex's parking lot responding to reports of a burglary. My graduate student, Leah Teeters, and I were with Patty and the family admiring the vegetables and fruits that were growing in 2 large plots that the family had planted in front and on the side of the apartment building. One of the police officers, noting that we'd been hanging around an awfully long time in the gardens, asked what we were doing. I responded that I worked at the university and that we were studying what the people in this community were doing to improve their neighborhood. I told him that these gardens, with their overflowing quantities of red and green chilies, watermelon, tomatoes, and eggplant, were evidence of their work. He was impressed, and he said that he's seen gardens like these popping up all over the place and didn't know how they'd gotten there. He added that they've changed the face of the neighborhood. So let me step out of this story to make a few additional remarks. So as the officer noticed, the neighborhood has changed. It has transformed in ways that have great potential consequence for individual and group practices and for the physical and sociocultural landscape of the city itself. Since Revision began its Backyard Garden initiative 5 years ago, they've established more than 200 backyard gardens. Over 30,000 pounds of fresh and organic fruits and vegetables are expected to be grown in the gardens this year. What people are doing in the neighborhood, their practices, their values, and who they are becoming has also changed. Participants in the program are growing and tending their gardens effectively. Families are developing new skills around canning and preserving the vegetables that they've grown. Neighbors are sharing their fruits and vegetables with each other, as well as their know-how about how to grow food. And the nonprofit's team of promotoras are developing a new sense of themselves as change agents for the neighborhood. How the promotoras and the nonprofit are creating meaningful social change in the neighborhood is the main focus of today's talk. But before I explore the case of revision in more depth, let me revisit the police officer's other comment, a question that some of you may have on your minds. What was I doing there? As a learning scientist and scholar who attends carefully to research methods, I study learning by examining people's everyday practices as they grapple with and solve meaningful problems. The work of a number of scholars studying learning in situated social practice has informed my view of learning and how we should study it. Jean Lave, Ray McDermott, and Rogers Hall have had particularly strong influence on my conceptions of learning. Building on Lave's situated perspective on learning, the focus of my research has been on the organization of consequential learning. What I mean by this is that I'm interested in understanding how changing forms of participation that allow people to be recognized as competent participants come to be valued in dynamic networks of practice. This view of learning, which pays simultaneous attention to changing forms of participation in contexts that have been produced historically and are changing themselves, is particularly relevant for doing research in non-dominant communities whose practices have historically not been highly valued. So to make this more concrete, consider this example from the sociologist Howard Becker, and all the first years you just read this stuff. Okay, in Tricks of the Trade, Becker writes, "We all have all sorts of traits. Only a few of these are socially marked as important because of the way they are embedded in a system of relations." He goes on to say that he is terrible at drawing. Who cares, you might say? Drawing isn't that important. And that is part of Becker's point. In the middle to late 19th century, some important people decided that the reason Americans were falling behind in industrialization was because American workers could not draw mechanical representations well. Schools, therefore, needed to be reorganized to teach American school children how to draw well. This, as you know, was not a long-lasting reform, as today, drawing is not a high priority for schools, and not knowing how to draw well is not a great consequence for school children. Becker's example speaks to the need to pay attention to how the world is built and maintained to make certain practices more or less necessary, valuable, and desired. Although Becker was not directly speaking about learning, learning scientists could benefit from this insight. It's my, no, that's right. It's my contention that people who study learning need to study what the practices are in which people are participating, how they are engaging in them, and how these practices and the identities associated with them are made to become consequential in the world. Critically, we also need to ask who benefits and who suffers from how the world is organized as it is. So I've organized my talk today to provide first some context on how I've studied and designed for consequential learning in my early research. With this background, I'll then share what I'm doing currently as part of the Learning in the Food Movement project. I'll conclude with implications for understanding and designing for consequential learning. So examining how learning becomes consequential in social practice and how we might imagine these practices otherwise has been a leading question in my research. As a scholar with strong commitments to developing grounded accounts of learning, I work from the perspective that studying the same set of issues, so in my case around learning and social practice, in multiple contexts will help me to uncover and articulate key dimensions of how learning takes place and becomes consequential. I'm going to share briefly some earlier work that I've done because it shows the origins of the approach that I take currently to design. So I've studied learning as changing forms of participation in changing communities in a variety of contexts, some of which are pictured here, including middle school mathematics classrooms, kindergarten, first grade science, professional development for school leaders, and pre-service teacher education. In each of these contexts, I asked, what is consequential for learners? How could I find out? And what kinds of social organization could make consequential learning possible? One of my answers is that you need to engage in the ethnographic study of learning in everyday life in order to find out what is consequential learning for particular historical actors. Learning is consequential in particular life worlds, not in general. And so ethnographies of those life worlds are necessary for making discoveries. In my research in these different settings, I've also identified resources, structural, material, and interactional, that could be configured differently to create more expansive opportunities for consequential learning. To illustrate how I've done this more fully in my research, I'm going to focus on just one of these projects. So in my studies of how middle school students learn mathematics, I studied learning as social and interactional achievement in the context of project-based curricula that were designed to resemble the real-world practices of professional designers such as architects and biologists. In this work, I employed methods of ethnography and interactional analysis to understand patterns of language use and activity that facilitated access to valued disciplinary practices. In the case of my dissertation research, yes, that becomes handy again, I considered how students learn to make mathematical generalizations. The starting assumption in this research was not that these practices were inherently important for children to learn, but rather that we needed to understand the potential future of these practices and how, based on that view, they could become made to become relevant for children. This interest in understanding how mathematics could become relevant to children was a focus of the broader Math at Work research project headed by Rogers Hall, in which my dissertation, in red here, was embedded. One of the questions we asked was whether and or how the target practices of professional adult designers related to and could be made to relate to what the middle school students were being asked to do in their classrooms. The students I studied participated in extended project-based curriculum units focused on architectural design and population modeling. Their classroom was what the school called a pre-algebra class, and their teacher described as the low-track math class. It was populated by a racially and socioeconomically heterogeneous group of students. The workplace practices our team studied included those of professional architects and biologists. Building on our team's multi-year ethnographic study of professional practices, we designed classroom interactions around key discourse practices and tools from the relevant workplaces to generate potentially new and more powerful ways for the young people to think about and engage in mathematics. Sometimes our designs were very productive for learning, and at other times they were not. So for instance, on one of the early days in the middle school kids' architectural design project, we brought in videotape of architects at work along with a set of tools that we'd seen the architects using. We were so excited to share this view into the authenticity of using math at work. The students were less so. After we showed them this really well done videotape, we asked them if they had any questions. Who cares? One of them asked. Why do we need to know this? This was an important, though somewhat painful critique. We had not yet created a system in which knowing about the practices of architects was meaningful or consequential for the students. So only once we, that is our team of teachers and researchers, did make the practices of the adult designers relevant to students' school practices, did the students' participation shift toward greater engagement in the design and mathematical aspects of their projects. Our research team tried to design for learning that could become consequential for students in a number of ways, based on our understanding of the professional designers' work practices. We brought in authentic tools to seed students' design projects. We created worked-up case materials like the videotape of the architects. And we brought the different worlds of practice, the students' design projects and the adult designers, together. In the first year of our project, we noticed that when the adult designers worked with the kids on their design projects, something cool happened. The adult designers, in this case, the biologists, engaged in what we later called recontextualizing practices. in which they asked kids to imagine what might happen in their mathematical model under different kinds of circumstances. This was a discourse practice that was very common to the biologist practice, but not to the students. What we noticed was that this kind of questioning practice was very productive for the students' mathematical engagement and learning. After we saw it happen one year, we planned for it to happen in the subsequent year of our project. That is, we designed participant structures and classroom events to leverage this discovery that we saw unfold unexpectedly in our classroom research. Using the methods of ethnography, we learned what could be consequential for people, and then we intentionally designed for it. So asking, what is consequential for learners, and how could I find out, followed by what kinds of social organization could make consequential learning possible, is the general approach that informs my design research. As I present my current research on learning in the food movement, I'm going to revisit these questions as a way to make my methodological approach more visible to you. So my current study of learning in the local movement for food access and social justice is an extension of my earlier research and an expansion of how learning scientists have conceptualized and investigated situated learning. So first, it focuses on the organization of consequential learning in a context in which knowledge and identity trajectories have neither been firmly established nor highly valued. The future of the local food movement is uncertain and contested. There are many directions in which it could proceed. So as a result, as a researcher, I'm getting to see how the conditions for consequential learning are getting built in real time. Second, my research team and I are studying activities led by community members, not educators or researchers alone. Community organizing has great potential to create lasting and meaningful change. That said, the learning sciences has not taken the explicit study of these kinds of on-the-ground movements as part of its research agenda. It's got a lot of text up there. So the Learning in the Food Movement project has had two main phases of work. In the first phase, we took a broad ethnographic look at how different people in organizations were engaged in the movement in a large Western metropolitan region spanning 3 mid-sized cities. Observing organized activities explicitly connected to the local food movement, interviewing different kinds of participants and stakeholders who identify as part of this movement, and documenting the conflicts that are shaping the future of the movement in our region of the country helped us appreciate how certain kinds of knowledge and ways of doing things were getting made to become consequential for different communities. Building on an in-depth analysis of the strategies that different groups were using to address issues of food access and social justice, in the second phase of our project, we focused our research, which I describe as community-based social design research, on the work of one community-based nonprofit. This organization, Revision, was the one whose backyard garden program I described in the opening vignette. In my research with Revision, we continue to use ethnographic methods to understand the cultural organization of how they do their work with the community. However, our research is now much more collaborative and problem-focused as we work with them on issues that are most pressing to them and the community they serve. As you'll notice, maybe because it's here, in both years of our social design work, my research team has collaborated with faculty and students from other disciplines and programs on these design efforts. We've done this because the complex social problems and innovative strategies that we set out to understand required distributed expertise, more than what any one discipline could provide. So as part of the broad ethnographic phase of the project, our research team studied a wide variety of community groups, programs, and agencies interested in issues of food access. Some of the activities we studied are pictured here. In this broad survey of activities, we asked, what is consequential for learners? How could we find out? and what kinds of social organization could make consequential learning possible. Our choice of a set of particular groups from this broad survey to study in greater detail was shaped by our interests in how community members were conceptualized as participants in these change efforts. We wanted to focus on groups that engage community participants as part of solutions rather than as part of problems. Our comparative analysis of the activities, aims, and processes that these groups use to change access to food for marginalized communities led us to describe a practice that my colleague Molly Shea and our former graduate and I call equity-oriented skill making. To explain equity-oriented scale making, I first need to explain my use of the term scale. So how I'm using scale is different from its typical usage. Oftentimes, people talk about scaling up, which involves taking something and making that thing bigger. When I use the term scale, borrowing largely from research in anthropology, I'm talking about the system of relations in which that thing exists and has meaning. So for example, we can talk about children's scores on a standardized test as part of a classroom scale of evaluation and instruction. We can also talk about these scores as part of a district-wide scale of evaluation and instruction. What the scores mean in each place and in particular moments of practice is vastly different and hold different implications for the organization of subsequent social action. My intention in using the term scale is to describe the relations between people, practices, and technologies, in particular spatial and temporal orderings of activity that give meaning to concepts and actions. Scales such as the local and the global can become related to each other through people's concerted action. The notion of scale making highlights the work that actors do to create and disrupt relations between scales. Scale making is a common feature of social movements. The notion of equity-oriented scale making names the agenda behind the scale making projects that we studied. Their aim is to facilitate the organization of better opportunities for marginalized communities to become recognizable as competent participants across scales and to exert agency within existing systems. Equity-oriented scale making requires thinking about relations between communities, sometimes communities that are historically at odds with each other. It also requires thinking about infrastructure, both as a resource and an impediment to consequential learning. Making infrastructure visible is a strategy, a method that we owe to Susan Lee Starr. Equity-oriented scale making involves identifying leverage points within inequitable systems, developing strategies for reorganizing scale relations to include the perspectives of historically marginalized groups, and imagining and coordinating trajectories of practice across scales so that these interventions can support learning as it is made to extend across contexts and become increasingly consequential over time. The three organizations we studied were all engaged in equity-oriented scale making, but developed different strategies and practices around which to organize their change efforts. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the work of revision to explain the idea of equity-oriented scale making and how this is related to the organizing of consequential learning. Revision is a community-based nonprofit founded by two ambitious and capable young men who grew up in the state and wanted to improve the quality of life for their city's most marginalized populations. As white men who are not from this particular community, they work consistently and reflectively as part of Revision to create a more inclusive and empowering organization. They currently serve on the staff as Revision's executive director and director of operations. Revision's staff also includes 8 promotoras, 7 women and 1 man from the community whose roles in the organization are multiple. Primarily, the promotoras aim to connect with community members to inform them of how they might participate in revisions initiatives and what they could gain from their participation. The promotoras are also teachers. They teach community members new skills related to the focus of different initiatives, and they learn from the community about issues that are pressing in their lives. They do this through sustained and caring relationships with community members and through more formal methods like surveys on residents' participation in revision-led initiatives. Revision views the challenges that people in Westwood face, including limited food access, neighborhood crime, and the lack of physical infrastructure for supporting safe transportation as a product of an unevenly developed, inequitable system. At the same time, they see the community as having the power to make meaningful and lasting change for themselves. These commitments are captured in Revision's mission statement, which reads, "To work with people in marginalized neighborhoods to develop leaders, cultivate community food systems, and grow a resilient local economy." Embedded in this statement is Revision's commitment to leveraging the community's social and cultural practices to transform the neighborhood. Promotoras are a critical component of this asset-based approach. As I mentioned earlier, the use of promotoras to facilitate community health and advocacy developed out of public health traditions originating in Latin America. The image on the left side, over here, I don't know if you can see it, of the screen, is a mural depicting a promotora collecting health data in a community. This approach was originally developed to help institutions like hospitals capitalize on the shared cultural practices and language backgrounds between promotoras and residents to facilitate desired health goals. Promotoras were seen as leaders and advocates, people, often but not exclusively women, who were trusted and highly regarded members of the community. As part of Revision's work to develop a community-based food system, Revision promotoras, who are pictured on the right, work to make authentic connections with families and to teach them to grow their own food in gardens that they help to design, plant, tend, and harvest. Promotoras do a lot more than gardening with the families in the Backyard Garden program. The relationships that the promotoras develop with families through weekly visits to the gardens ensure flourishing gardens and help the promotoras to learn about the community's needs and desires, from figuring out how to access mental health supports to getting legal assistance and locating educational resources. The work in the gardens is one way in which promotoras get to hear from community members about their concerns and desires for the neighborhood. This information is shared with Revision, and from there shapes the organization's further work in the community and their plans for future programming and funding priorities. Revision's work in the community has created new scale relations and trajectories for people and practices to move across scales. The Backyard Garden program, for instance, has created an extensive network of garden participants who can now regularly share resources, ideas, and questions with each other via the promotoras and community-wide events that the nonprofit organizes with them. This stands in contrast to how the residents of the neighborhood used to be fairly anonymous to each other or previously only connected via familial links. Many people in the neighborhood have thus become mobilized for action related to a variety of issues, from developing a food cooperative for the neighborhood where the vegetables and fruit grown in the backyard gardens can be sold, to improving transportation in Westwood, to keeping marijuana dispensaries off their main street. Yes, I mentioned marijuana dispensaries. From Colorado. All right. So let's take the food cooperative as a specific example of creating new scale relations. This has become a possibility to extend practices and produce from backyard gardens to the neighborhood scale because of the efforts on the part of Revision to pursue and receive a U.S. Department of Agriculture grant and other grants to fund the development of the cooperative in the neighborhood. The efforts on the part of Revision staff members, including its executive director, the Director of Operations, and the promotoras to participate actively in discussions of city, state, and national policy around the future of agriculture have enabled this to happen. Revision's work across scales, from family gardens to neighborhood, state, and national scales, has helped them to forge new pathways for learning that could have a lasting and consequential impact on community residents, the promotoras, and the neighborhood. Scale-making projects often involve tensions, as they are designed to disrupt and create new forms of consequential learning in and across contexts. I know you can't see that, but I love this, and I put it there for a reason. It says, "Keep your coins, I want change." One tension that we identified in our study relates to groups aiming to work with rather than for communities. All the groups we studied strive to work with community on problems that matter to the community. But oftentimes, the group's division of labor drew distinctions between us and them that limited their capacity for learning from each other and moving a common agenda forward. At Revision, for instance, the executive director, the director of operations, and the promotoras do not have the same skill set, nor are the skills that they have equally valued in the current system of relations in which their work is embedded. This has created some tension around what kinds of practices and forms of participation are becoming consequential, in what kinds of contexts, and for which participants in the organization. How might the Revision staff imagine a different way of organizing work practices and organizational structures to pursue more fully their aims for community empowerment? This is an issue that everyone at Revision takes seriously and wants to address as they expand their vision for the neighborhood. In the second phase of our project, we've worked with Revision to grapple with this tension and to think with them about how the group might develop a more shared understanding of what's involved in making the collective effort productive for everyone involved. So the work we're doing with Revision as part of the second and current phase of our project is best described as a community-based social design experiment. It's an approach to doing design research that values the use of ethnographic research that is oriented towards creating sustainable forms of social change. Uriah Engstrom, who's helped develop methodological approaches that inform the use of social design experiments, describes this kind of approach as focused on the exploratory creation of new ideas and practices, research that is oriented towards how things might or should be, rather than how things are. In line with our own Chris Gutierrez's conceptualization of social design experiments, my research with Revision is defined by the following features. It is focused on problems of practice. It is deeply collaborative and responsive to the tensions and desires of the participants in the system. And it introduces new tools that leverage the repertoires of practice of non-dominant communities to envision different social arrangements and different kinds of social futures. Social design experiments are not linear processes, but iterative in that each dimension of the work shapes and informs the others. For analytic ease, I am next going to describe the logic and organization of our social design research with Revision, knowing full well that this description will sound much more linear than it was or than it is. Social design research focuses on problems that matter to the communities involved. Understanding what those problems are and how different stakeholders in the community define them and think they should be approached is a significant part of this early phase of a social design experiment. The City Mayor's Policy Group, who funded in part our early work with Revision, was interested in enhancing the economy through local food. One dimension of their larger vision was that they saw great potential in the promotora model for empowering neighborhoods across the city to grow local food and promotoras as a first job based on a local food-driven economy. Through interviews with the promotoras, we learned that while some of the promotoras expressed interest in extending their work into other communities in the city, for the majority of them, a more pressing priority was enhancing their own professional practices and becoming better advocates for their own community. The promotoras wanted to learn to work smarter, not just to work more or harder. The promotora model thus had different spatialized and future-oriented meanings across the city governments and the promotoras' scales of practice. Given these diverse perspectives, the problem of practice on which my research team focused our research design was on coordinating these potential meanings of the promotora model across different scales. The questions that guided our next steps were, again, what is consequential for learners? How could we find out? And what kinds of social organization could make this consequential learning possible? At the start of our social design work at Revision, we focused on learning from the promotoras and with the promotoras about what they do. This was our attempt to understand the nature of the promotora model and how it could be enhanced. In the first year with Revision, we co-designed a series of workshops led in Spanish and English with the promotoras focused on seeing the issues in their work with which they struggled and wanted to improve. We learned a lot of different things from the workshops. One of the most significant issues was that many of the promotoras wanted to have more significant leadership roles in the organization, where they could contribute to Revision's plans for the future. To facilitate that discussion, in our final workshop, which you can't really see, we invited the executive director and the director of operations from Revision to work with the promotoras to imagine different ways that their work could become and feel more shared. The insights I gained from these discussions around how to reorganize work practices and organizational structures to become more transparent and inclusive have deeply informed the current iteration of our social design experiment. Beginning in the fall of this past year, we've collaborated with Revision staff along with faculty and students in the Information and Communication Technology for Development program at CU Boulder, ICTD, to facilitate Revision's equity-oriented skill-making efforts. Together, we designed a promotora app. We built this app with careful attention to the significance of the cultural and historical practices of the promotoras. As I mentioned previously, based on the work that we've done in the community and with the promotoras, we learned that many of the activities related to the traditional notion of being a promotora have not been documented systematically in the data sources that Revision has been collecting on the outcomes of their programs. In this field note excerpt, Patty shared some of the ways that she has helped families in the community beyond gardening. She mentions strategizing around how to deal with the challenges of managing a family when a parent needed to return to Mexico for work, locating legal aid for a family struggling with the aftermath of a crime, and pointing residents to English classes in the neighborhood. Revision has collected information on things like pounds of vegetables grown and changes in families' dietary practices, which are certainly relevant for the current funders of their initiatives. But these data do not capture the immense amount of relationship and network building that the promotoras do routinely when they work in the neighborhood, and that Patty was talking about here. Recognizing this near absence in their data, in our research with the technology and development team, we co-designed a promotora app to try to document these dimensions of the promotora's work. As part of this collaborative effort, we worked with the lead promotora and a team of master's students in the technology and development program. Together, we designed an app and a process for the promotoras to learn to use the app so that they can systematically collect and input data on each of their visits to a family garden. The promotora app built on and extended a survey that Revision had been using for years to collect information on the backyard gardens. The original paper and pen survey was completed by the promotoras and then uploaded into an Excel file by the Director of Operations. This division of labor was laborious and did not create a way for the promotoras to learn to use valued technological tools such as Excel, nor how to analyze the data that they were generating to improve their own practice. With the use of the Promotora app, promotoras have learned to use a new technology, Android tablets that run a free and open source software program called Open Data Kit that allows them to collect data on their work practices that can be easily synced to a database that's housed at the revision offices. The Promotora app currently runs one survey that the promotoras use when they make visits to the backyard gardens. To capture some of the additional work that promotoras are doing on these visits around relationship and network building, we've included one open-ended question that was not part of the original revision survey. This question asks promotoras to write down what else they did when they were in the field. They might, for instance, write about topics like what conversations did they have with families, what challenges related to the garden or something else came up in their discussions, and what resources might they need to identify to help a family with a pressing issue. This open-ended question, though small, has created a space for promotoras to document some of the foundational, though previously almost invisible work they have been doing to transform their neighborhood. With further training on using the Promotora app, answering this open-ended question, and developing future surveys that can be run using the app, a number of new kinds of activities have become possible, and in some cases are already now happening. Some of the changes instigated by the use of the Promotora app include the easy accessibility of information via the use of the app to provide nearly on-the-spot feedback to improve promotoras' practices in the field. The ease with which to generate systematic information on the promotora's impact on the neighborhood, and learning on the part of the promotoras to use a powerful technological tool that allows them to share and extend the reach of their practices across expansive, geographically dispersed networks. These changes are initial steps toward the further documentation and analysis of the nature of the promotora's work and the key dimensions of Revision's Promotora model. This type of analysis could help Revision, and is helping Revision, to articulate the nature of this model and what it would take to use this model in other neighborhoods. Further, with the use of the Promotora app, the promotora's practices have been rescaled to connect with powerful and far-reaching networks that include, but are not limited to, neighborhood residents, potential funders, and city and state policymakers. Our development of the Promotora app is an equity-oriented scale-making intervention that my team brought to the partnership with Revision. As part of making it, we've had to change the scale of working relations at Revision between the staff of the organization and the communities they serve and work within. The Promotora app holds the potential to change the work of food activism and community support. And it is a direct response to my team's discovery that the promotoras wanted to learn to work smarter. The app is not interesting only because it involves mobile, tablet-based computing. It is interesting because it rescales work in the community, and it opens up new possibilities for consequential learning. So I want to conclude today with insights I've gained from my empirical analyses of organizing for consequential learning in the food movement and across my prior research studies. The consequentiality of learning is instantiated across multiple spatial and temporal scales of practice. Infrastructure shaping the relations between scales can be both an impediment and a resource for consequential learning. And scale making is a strategy for organizing consequential learning. Scales are not pre-given, neutral, or static. In terms of what I've learned related to designing for consequential learning, the insights I've gained can be summarized as a set of principles. The first is that We need to do ethnographic research to understand the practices that matter in and across scales of activity and the meaning that people give to these practices. We need to identify resources, structural, cultural, material, and interactional, that could be configured differently to create more expansive opportunities for consequential learning. The cycle of work, moving from ethnography to design, is not a one-time event, but should occur throughout the life of a project. It needs to be long-term and iterative because people and organizations change in important ways, and these changes should shape our designs and our goals. And last, our designs for consequential learning need to be grounded in our understandings of the historically established patterns of participation and tensions present in situated practices, because these will shape how our designs are embraced, ignored, or actively resisted. I'm done. I have a lot of people to thank, and I just want to pause for a second. I don't want this to get lost in applause. Revision has been an amazing partner. The Learning in the Food Movement team, which has had many iterations, has been wonderful. Leah Teeters and Molly Shea especially deserve my thanks. And all the people who funded this have been great, but the students in the qualitative research method sequence have been helpers in this project who've helped me conceptualize it and collect the data on the project. So really, thank you, everybody. Ben Kirshner, do you have a question? That's not a plant, is it? Okay. That's not bad.
No, I really enjoyed hearing you talk, and this idea of scaling is helpful in a lot of ways, and the consequential learning presentation. And so I have a few different things I'd want to hear more about, but the place I'm curious about that I'll start now and we can talk more later is sort of towards the end when you're talking about consequential learning. In my mind, as I was thinking about what you talked about, you could be, on one hand, we could think about consequential learning for an organization, like an organization learning, or a network of people who are learning sort of together, but then you could also be thinking about an individual person who's learning, and that how their learning is consequential for their own trajectory. And I'm wondering, you know, if you would give pride of place to one of those two units of analysis, or maybe there's a third that's actually more important, like the broader system. But in terms of the entity that is learning and changing, are you interested in both of those, or how do you think
I'm
about
interested in all. What I'm thinking right now is all three of those.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about individuals' practices, group practices, like at the organizational level, but also like communities or broader macro level changes. I mean, that's what my argument is that we have to think about people changing, like what they're doing. And what those practices are, but then how those practices become consequential. And so, you know, Kevin O'Connor and I have talked a lot about, you know, Bruno Latour's ideas about like, you have to prepare the world. These kinds of innovations, they don't take hold if the world hasn't been prepared to accept them as innovations and to see people as competent. So we can keep talking.
Thanks.
Hi, Mike.
Did this change teaching and learning in the qualitative methods classes? Is this a different approach involving the students?
Oh, yeah. Is Margaret Eisenhardt here? I can take all the credit or blame for this. We have in the past, how many years? 2 or 3 years, I think. We have always thought that we want students to engage in learning by doing. So being part of a research project, your own or someone else's, right? And so we've really thought about how, I want to think about this in terms of consequential learning. We've asked students to participate in faculty projects so that they would have the benefit of faculty members' conceptualization of a bigger project, where faculty members have already thought through what their research question is, why it matters, and like what theories will become relevant or could become consequential for the problem, right? And so students have been embedded in those projects and been doing it. So this project has been one of those projects. Yeah, so I have like a number of the graduates of doing that in here. Chris?
Can you provide some examples of how that app provided like that immediate feedback? So if somebody was giving
Yeah.
information or getting a feedback loop from it, what was that immediate, what are some examples of that immediate?
Yeah, so Leah Teeters is here also, so you should also jump in. And this is something that we have been thinking about with them. We're still working on it. I mean, the thing exists. It's a very simple app. Though I did not make it, that's why we have collaborators. The one thing we were thinking, or that is perhaps going to get built in at one time, is that right now, each promotora inputs information in a survey. When they drive past the Region office, it gets synced into their database. Right now, the director of operations and the lead promotora have access to the information that each promotor creates or inputs from the gardens. We have thought about, and I think we're going to be in discussion with them around how everybody could have access. So I know your interest in transparency. It's like everyone could have access to what everybody else is doing, because we do think, at least from our research perspective and teaching perspective, that having that opportunity to see what other people are doing and what other people are asking and what other people are writing will help all of them. But that is something that right now they're not there because they have other reasons for what they're doing and why they're keeping a little bit more centralized. Val. Thank you, Valerie Otero, for making me do this.
You. All I have to do is make a flyer. No, so social design experiment. It seems to me that social design experiment and consequential learning are somewhat synonymous with one another. Almost meaning kind of the same thing, which is, I think, this, and that's what I'm asking help for, this multimodal kind of multimodal learning. I don't want to say.
Do you mean multimodal, or do you mean like kind of multiple scales and times? Is that what you mean? Or?
Yeah, probably multiple scales and times and populations, because there's not just the, like Ben was pointing out, there's the community that has the learning and norming, I guess is the word I'm looking for.
Okay.
Learning and norming that's occurring through this person's interactions in the community, which thereby changes the community's ways of accepting this individual by virtue of their modified behavior.
Yes.
Which then, kind of is kind of give and take, and it's not just two, it's probably less.
That's right.
More.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, how does that apply to other ways? I mean, does it always apply to any kind of institutional change?
I would probably say that it could apply. I mean, I would want to figure out and do the work. I mean, like I said, or pointed to, that I do kind of grounded theory work. I would definitely think that it could apply. I've been applying that lens to my previous work because that really helped me understand, like, does this thing apply? Does it apply to math at work classrooms that we're working across, with workplaces and kids in it? I didn't used to think that, but I can see how that was what we were up to. We were kind of creating new skill relations, and we were doing it in this collaborative kind of way. So I think it's got that kind of great potential. Chris and I will mention, like, we are writing about this right now, and we are thinking about applying these ideas to social design firms and really thinking through how to articulate the nature of social design work. I mean, that is a new way of doing research. And as I was mentioning to, like, Christy, I mean, it's a new way of doing research. I think it has great potential. I think it also makes you have to change the way you think about what it means to do research. The outcomes, the relationships, issues like transparency and validity in research. But
well, it would seem like it would be the perfect method structure to apply to the change of the valuing of teaching for tenure at a university.
That's right. I mean, I think of it as like teaching in the El Pueblo. So Anthony, you're here from the 4411 class and El Pueblo Mágico, and I think about it as how to think about the changes that are going on in our classes. And then when the undergraduates and the undergraduate learning at the university, and in relation to this after school club that's in the community, all of that is happening across all these different scales of practice. What matters and what's consequential in each of those are not always the same. I saw hands, Kevin.
Just in response to what Valerie was saying, it seems to me that given that consequences are always organized as opposed to given, that and the question of what it applies to everything, I think, in the sense that stability is organized and just as much as changes. And so it applies to a physics classroom in the university, that's been doing the same thing for a long time, just as much as it applies to the work that Susan was talking about. Seems to be a theoretical frame for seeing what learning is, that changes what, how we look at it and what we have to look at in order to understand it.
Yeah.
I have just a kind of question. I find it really intriguing the way in which the app facilitates the promotoras' ability to kind of represent who they are and what they're doing and the complexity of their relationship and the impacts that they're having. But at the same time, I'm wondering about the implications for the relationship of trust. So if I'm talking with a mother and the mother's son has gone to jail and I need help around legal aid, that's something that I can imagine would be a conversation that comes from trust and expectation of confidentiality. And so if I'm now, as a promotora, wanting to document that I'm providing that kind of support, are there ways in which they're representing that in what they're writing on the app so that they maintain kind of that trust relationship, while at the same time, in some ways, they're trying to develop valuing of what they're doing. So how is that unfolding?
Well, so those are, I mean, we are watching that kind of thing unfold right now. And we definitely are thinking about it, and it's part of our, we do take a sociocultural or cultural historical activity theory chat. I hate saying that out loud. Perspective, but really thinking about when you introduce new tools, how does it, alter the system? How does it change the way people are relating to each other? And we're studying that. We are studying it. And I do think that the group, we didn't say, hey, make an app, because we think that's the most important thing. We worked with them around, what can we do? What's the next important step for you? And we have to think about it in each step. When we think about training and working with the promotoras, what are they going to write in that field? Why would they write it? I mean, I talk a lot about you write it because you need to make this important work that you're doing visible to funders. You need to make it visible to policymakers because they don't know what you're doing.
Right.
And they keep talking about the kind of, not the wrong part, but one part of what your activity is, right? But I do think that it is an important issue, and I think that the promotoras absolutely have that as the heart of their practice. So I don't fear that that's going to become an issue, but I'm always thinking about it because I worry about that.
Right.
But I also worry about people working and doing all of this good work and getting no credit for what they're doing because nobody knows what it is, but everybody running to pick it up and extend it everywhere. Because that's not right. Lori.
So now I want to ask two different questions, but the original one was going to be to ask how you have changed. You showed us a little bit of designing for when you talked about your work with Rogers, but it is your stance and your values that created the opening for things like the change in roles between the executive director and the promoter. So can you give, you're not the same person as when you started.
I have to say, I realized that from thinking a lot back on this and remembering what I did and what my original dissertation, I'm trying to get you, Becky, my original dissertation question was that I have always had these interests. I was I considered switching over to work in the sociology department to become a feminist sociologist. I brought those kinds of dispositions to the work that I was doing in the Math at Work project and to my work collaborating with teachers. Always interested in collaboration and how can we do things that matter for you, because I'm obviously not in this for the money, right? So let's think about, what could we do together? I think what has changed is that I'm lucky to have I feel like the field is changing. And so I'm lucky, Chris is here and Bill is here. People who are really thinking about what does it mean to design with communities has become something that I'm yes, that's what I've been wanting to do. I want to work on ways that we can work and do research with people where it feels empowering to everybody involved. everybody has a greater sense of learning. And that's why I've drawn to community of learners and a community of practice kind of approach to thinking about learning. I want to think about the whole system. I just have not always foregrounded that in my work, but I feel like in this project I have been able to do that. But it's always been there. It's always in the method section of my research articles.
But it's also, to your point about scaling up, and, you know, I hope you're keeping a list of, like, the trust question and that core value that you have.
Yeah.
But it doesn't generalize necessarily, you know, when it gets exported, when these ideas get exported. And that's what, you know, that's what's so impressive, but also then worrisome when the city's just going to do this everywhere. Well, they're not going to do this.
No, we're
everywhere.
going to do something else.
And so that's just really.
Well, they're
hard.
not doing it, so that's another, you know, that was a hold, slow down and pause, because we're not going to do the kind of research that you want to help do your thing. We are going to help you, it's going to be slower, and it's going to hopefully have more integrity towards the model. Bill?
I just want to underline that maybe then the difference between the scale up model is that I think this notion of scale making reinforces the way that all scaling is a local activity. And at some level, even though there's rescaling and connecting, it's always done by people,
That's right.
right? And so there is no fast route. And the scale-up model is pretty fundamentally flawed for transforming practice. Because it really does involve, at every level, remaking relations.
Yep.
And it never leaves that space.
Absolutely. Joe?
So I want to go back to something that you said early on about the math, in the Math at Work project.
Yeah.
You said you, the generalizing, the mathematical practice of generalizing was, you didn't want to impose it on them because you thought it was important.
That's right.
You wanted it to become consequential.
Well,
You wanted to look at what was
That's right.
consequential
That's
for students. Yeah. So.
could
but
become consequential.
Yeah. So this is where the question I want to ask is around that whole dynamic, because I think in thinking about your current work, people who see your current work might say, well, that idea works really well in this turbulent, emerging kind of arena like learning in the food movement. But can I really, me, this person working in K-12 schools with standards and all the things, can I really afford to say that I want to pay attention to what's consequential for students rather than trying to make the things that are part of the curriculum important? So how do you think about the difference between those things, and how do you suggest people negotiate that tension?
Well, so I've got many responses to that, okay? And I'm sure lots of people in this room do too. I think one response is that you do need to be thinking about both of those questions at the same time. So you have to think about why you're doing it and why it's going to matter for anybody. And people like, you know, Randy Engel, who is a wonderful scholar in our field, talks about, you know, how when you're teaching math or whatever, you do have to talk about why this thing is going to matter for your future practices. And she talked about that and explained that, like, doing that helps kids generalize. It helps them transfer information from one context into another because they're using it as practice. So that's one thing. You do have to think about it. The second is, and I say this in my undergraduate classes, that you're not just a cog in the machine, you are also, you're making the machine too. So like, you have to think about what is your role going to be in making this thing work, this system, and how are you going to work together and collaborate with other like-minded folks to question all the time. So that's another thing. So I do think you have to think about yourself that way. And I do also think that is hard work, but you are always involved in it. So it may seem like it's stable right now, but it's not stable. It's changing. This just feels like math education is always undergoing some sort of reform. I mean, it just is. It just has the feeling of being more stable. So that's an awful point. I guess that third point, I do think that when you do research, people could do research, and like researchers play an important role of asking those kinds of questions about what's consequential, why are we doing this, how can we learn, and how might we change, or how might we imagine a different way of organizing the classroom or the discourse or the tools so that we can get a different kind of outcome. And I don't think that we're not doing that work. I think we are doing that work. We just don't always talk about and represent our work in that way. I see Ben has been trying.
I just want to follow up on Joe's question, because I think this is important, and I would personally like to understand it better. So the term consequential learning could be construed as sort of a value neutral, or consequential could be value neutral. So for example, something could be
value open,
or value open,
to
sure, to different ways. But to use the math example, there are consequences to, say, failing or doing really poorly on a particular test, to ones that, gatekeeping mechanisms, et cetera, in the same way that sort of exchange value. I'm sort of mapping it onto that distinction between exchange value and use value.
Yes.
But so in your view, when you use the term, I'm curious if you're using it in that open way, or do you mean it, would you align it with authentic, is it sort of authentic learning is consequential learning? Does that make sense? So I'm wondering what the term
I'm
means.
not sure what you mean by authentic, but I do think that the consequentiality is defined by the people in the practices. And so and I think it's an ongoing conversation, so I don't think that they necessarily know all that's possible for them, but that comes out of having discussions and working with new tools and trying out different ways of doing things that you can crack open their understanding.
Can I push on that right there? Because consequential, using your drawing example, is imposed or negotiated by other people, but not, a fourth grader.
Right.
And then some people use consequential to mean relying on the resources and cultural practices that the kids are bringing with them. And those two are the same thing. If some imposed authority said, you have to know this about mathematics. So I was a little confused by the drawing example, because that could be negotiated by others, but not the immediate participant, the fourth grader.
That's right. And I mean, that's what I think what I wanted to draw out is that consequentiality is defined in a system of relations. So it's not just me, and it's not just all of you, but it's also what else in the world, like what other networks of practice are making those ideas valuable or not valuable.
So if you're designing for consequential learning, presumably you're designing for particular kinds of consequential learning.
Yeah, that's right.
Because
And you're
consequential is
designing
negative and positive, right?
That's right. And so you're designing with. That's right. You're
Yeah.
designing with. You're open to it. You've got to. I mean, it's not easy work. Like I've decided, this mathematical formula is a thing that everybody has to learn. It's not that.
Right.
And I don't think that's what math people do either. I mean, but that's what it sometimes looks like or sounds like.
But at the same time, it's not, the risk here is also overemphasizing, like the math example that you gave earlier about how, it's necessary to help or that when you help students realize it's good for their future, that, that somehow is better. And for me, that's, how do you know what's consequential to me regarding mathematics?
So I just want to make clear, the Math at Work project took as its fundamental question, everybody says math is important because it will get you to become an architect or a scientist, whatever. And our question was, what in the world do people who are architects and biologists, what are they doing? Are they using math? Because nobody was really looking. And that was it wasn't a taking of authenticity as our goal. That was not the goal. The goal is just what is happening.
Right, but I was thinking from the student's perspective, imposing that this is
correct
valuable, and I'm saying the whole reason I went into education was because it was like, can I just learn it because it's bitchin'?
Right.
Not because it's useful for my future? Yeah.
And they basically told, that's why I shared the example. When that kid said, who cares? It was a big, I wish I had a picture of my advisor's face. I have it, but it would be too embarrassing. It was just all the all the emotion you put into these projects, and you think, I know this is great, it's gonna be great, and then they look at you and like, could care less. You know, because it's like, well, am I really connecting with you
They care
around
about
what
something
matters?
different than
You
what
care
you
about
think
something else.
is.
Well, and
The
then when we
student cares about
figured
something
out the
different.
way to connect, and once we did, it became something that, oh, cool, now it's cool, this is something I do want to learn, right? Vicky.
I got you guys. I'm gonna ask you. Oh, okay. I'm just trying to get my head around scale. What is a scale? And so, can you help me locate it a little bit? Is it like a network of practices, a network of like practices, or community practice, or how are you thinking of that?
I think it's a hard one for me to define, which I spent quite a lot of time on there. I mean, a lot to define quickly, but I talk about it as like I do think of it as like a system of relations that includes people, practices, and technologies in particular spatial and temporal orderings of activity.
Okay.
So you can talk about, and gosh, I've said this so many times, you can talk about like local scales of activity, global scales of activity. Those are spatial. You can also talk about historical scales of activity and future-oriented or life history scales, right? So those are all scales of relations, and those are not given. When we decide, like, well, we're going to talk about, you know, there's some kind of banking organization, and they position themselves as transnational, that's a move, that's a strategy for positioning themselves and what they're doing and what they want to relate to. So when we think about when we are scaling up, I do think it's a useful tool, and it is like very much used in geography and anthropology, to think about what we're scaling. You can't, if you pluck one idea from that, that's not how I'm thinking about it. It's the, like, Jordan, my husband, and I've talked quite a lot about this, but it's like you change the meaning. The scales, why I'm keeping scale is because it emphasizes the meaning of those things that are in it.
But the relationships that,
And then the
different
relationships.
scales, they could shift.
That's right. Well, it's different. You can make different kinds of connections between scales and even within scales.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. But scales themselves, you're seeing them kind of ordered temporally and spatially. Thank you. Okay.
That's right.
So, thank you for a fascinating presentation.
Yes,
I
thank you for
appreciate your
helping
work
fund
and,
this.
I guess a thread that keeps coming back to me in all this work is the importance of your partner, Revision, and the opportunities, the openness they provided in allowing for this consequential learning to take place. And as you write about this and talk about, I would presume, partnerships and the consequences this might have for others who want to do this kind of work, will you be trying to document those dimensions that are very important in really trying to provide opportunities for this kind of social change?
So opportunity, and will I be, I'm sorry, the opportunities
Well,
for...
so it seems that, you know, the role of the promotora, the role of your agency, Revision, were just so critical in accomplishing what has been accomplished. And so that raises, for me, issues of sustainability. You know, will they be here a year from now, 2 years from now? And also, what might you have learned that you would want to replicate or advise your students, or when you look to do another project? What will you be looking for in those partners?
Yeah, well, we looked for a long time. So I'm like trying to remember whenever my sabbatical year was, or at that time, that's when I started looking. And we have been through, and there are people in this room who've been through many different organizations, and we looked for different kinds of people whose views on social change and learning and how they think about working in with non-dominant communities. We looked for all of that stuff, and we didn't find a ton of groups where we felt like they were going to be open to having a team of people who were really asking for like critical reflection on their process to be there. So I do think that has been really important. terms of like working, I mean, I guess I'm taking this a different direction. The relationship building that we have done with them and that I've been doing with them over the past 12 hours, particularly around giving this talk and talking with them about using their name and why that's important to them, and it really is important to them. All that stuff is like what we don't often talk about in our research. It is absolutely fundamental to the kind of social design research that we're doing.
So
and
I encourage you to write about that.
I am writing about it, and I am writing about it, and we're presenting on it. And Leah Teeters is really taking that up, the relationship building and how that relationship stuff is happening through, the micro-interactional levels, through the different uses. I mean, we speak, it's a hybrid language environment. We use Spanish, we use English, we use anything we can get to help make this happen, we use it. And that's something that we haven't been, and Chris knows that we're going to be writing about this, that like, people have not been writing about that stuff in social design research and in design-based research. And so we're going to be writing about that. And there's a way to do it, I think, where it's not about just building rapport, which is what qualitative research has often talked about. It's not that only. We're also doing the work of designing things. All this is happening around the things and the practices that we are creating together. And in all of those, everyone knows I talk about this all the time, that like in all of that, there always are problems and like the tension or the, what's the word, there's the problem or the fear that we are reproducing hierarchical power relations that we do not want to get in the way of our work together, but that happen. And when they happen, what do we do about those things? Because anytime you design that, Jordan, I'm going to say my favorite quote, that like Foucault talks about, you know what you do and you know why you do what you do, but you do not know what you do does. And that is something that I feel like that should be the tagline, but that probably would not be a good tagline for my email, because we're designers and we have to think about the fact that like we do our best, but guess what? You do stuff and like, who knows what's going to happen with it? I don't, but at least I want to be reflective in my writing and the stuff that my students do, where they're constantly thinking about it, but not paralyzed by the idea that, oh, well, I'm going to make a mistake, and then I'm going to do all this, like, recolonizing. It's like, you might, but then when you do, stop. You know? That's my advice to students. Thank you. All right, thank you.